Welcome to the release of the refinery decommissioning report, which is much needed. And I would like to introduce you to the speakers. We have Greg Karras, who is the writer of the report, community energy resource. Andres Soto, who is the advocate for Richmond environmental justice, member of Community for a Better Environment. Maureen Brennan from Rodeo, community advocate, and Steve Garey, who is a retired refinery worker, U.S. worker, United Steelworkers. So these four speakers, after they speak, will be followed by a question and answer period. There's a question and answer button at the bottom, and you can post your questions for the panelists in real time, but the answers will be answered after the presentations. So, so Greg, would you like to start?
Sure. This is Greg Karras. I was honored to lead the research and write this report. And I wanted to just thank you, Eduardo. Eduardo Martinez is a Richmond City Councilman, and he's agreed to MC this, this event. So thank you, Eduardo. Ready to get started?
We are ready. Let's. Can
everyone see this?
Yes.
Okay. So California communities host the dominant oil refining center in Western North America. Mountains largely isolated from US refining centers, it refines 3 times the crude extracted in the state, makes that oil burnable in transport and industry, and exports refined fuels across the West Coast and the Pacific Rim. Well to wheel, the oil refined here emits more carbon than all other activities in the state combined. That's the starting point for this analysis. And I should just say that I'm going to try to get through the book in 7 minutes or less. So bear with me, and then let's talk about it. This chart shows cumulative emissions because that is what drives climate impact. It assumes all non-petroleum emissions meet state climate targets. Total statewide emissions would still exceed the red line shown soon and by a lot. How much depends on whether refiners switch to higher or lower carbon oil. That's plausible, but even if they rebuild for the average US crude slate and more, do everything technically feasible to lower their carbon intensity, they only go from where they are now, scenario S1 in the chart, down to scenario S4. That's about the average US crude slate, plus all of the technology measures they could do. This shows that even if we do everything else, we must refine less oil if we hope to meet the climate limit. That red line, the climate limit, it's the limit defined by state climate targets through 2050. This is the state's share of global carbon cuts to between 1.5 and 2 degrees C. So if we hope for a livable climate, we're going to have to refine less oil. California is no exception to the global consensus on that. Cumulative emission impacts force steeper refining cuts to meet our climate limit if we delay. This example shows that for 2 annual refining cut trajectories, with no change in the carbon intensity of oil in either of those curves. The black curve waits until 2029 to start cutting oil rates. The green curve starts in 2021. Both trajectories meet the 2050 climate limit because the difference in cumulative emissions between them before the curves cross is the same as the difference after they cross. So that's what you're looking at. And that shows how delay forces cutting refining rates much more each year in order to meet the 2050 climate limit. And if more refining capacity is lost in a year to make those deeper rate cuts, more of the community's oil-dependent tax and jobs base needs to be replaced with sustainable alternatives that fast, or we risk serious transition impacts, or break our climate, or both. This is, I'm going to take a minute on this because it's really important. This is simple math that's about mass and velocity. How much emissions mass and how fast is our current oil-based economy putting it out there? It's important. I think climate scientists need to do a better job of explaining it, so I'm going to give you an example. Imagine you're in a car, you're headed towards a cliff. Does it matter how soon you hit the brakes? Now imagine everybody's in the car together. The increase in transition impact potential with delay is shown by the height of the black, red, and orange bars in this chart. The black bars are the likely case with no change in carbon intensity, but the worst case shown in red is still plausible. Note the 20% mark. Few, if any, California communities that host refineries have grown their tax base 20% per year lately. And those taxes mean jobs for teachers, firefighters, librarians, and more. This is the transition feasibility and climate protection feasibility crisis coming to us soon if we fail to act now. What if we start now and give ourselves the time we need to gradually retire and replace refinery-based economics, to decommission them? No one is saying that will be easy. Just that we can rebuild 4 to 7% of the oil-dependent tax and jobs base annually with transition support. And the fundamental economics that make jobs-rich, just transitions possible are clear, as these Census Bureau data show. Again, that's if we decommission refinery capacity gradually by starting now. We can start now without risk to California's fuel supply, because the refiner's huge exports also are a huge cushion. In fact, that cushion is more than we need to start now and decommission refining gradually, much more with the telecommuting and cheaper electric cars that are coming. Which raises a question: how much of this excessive refining for export should stop now? Refining for export worsens pollution in frontline communities. And since California refineries are locked into a high carbon crude slate, addressing that injustice reduces the carbon intensity of oil globally. But it is also true that keeping some of this export cushion might smooth transitions for refinery workers in some of our communities. Let's come back to this question after Steve Garey talks. We should keep talking about how to get through this together. That's the big truth about what this report is about. We need to talk about how we're going to break free from our toxic relationship with oil before it takes us over a cliff. Eduardo, back to you.
Thank you. I would like to turn the floor over to Andres Soto, who is from the Communities for a Better Environment. And he's done a lot of excellent work in Richmond around Chevron and the other refineries in the Bay Area. Andres?
Thank you, Eduardo. Yeah, I'm here to raise up the voice of people who live in and around refineries in particular, and other sources of industrial pollution. This report is an important landmark report for a number of reasons. One, it points out a pathway by which we can begin to address these questions of refinery decommissioning as a community, giving us the math that shows that this is a process that requires community-wide participation and not just arguing about whether or not we're going to close refineries or not. Did you drive here in a car or not? This is a fundamental question not only about global survival, but it's about addressing the economic and racial injustices that have been part of the systems of oppression that has been elevated recently by Black Lives Matter. In a community like Richmond, it shows that, you know, we are a community of predominantly people of color. That means we are majority Latino, African American, Asian community. We're only 20% Euro-American. And so the crossover of class and race is ever present. We have seen how now we need to use local land use authority within the city of Richmond to begin to use the permitting process to reduce pollution through regulatory action. We need the Bay Area Air Quality Management District to finally start addressing this as a social and racial justice issue by imposing the strongest technologies to reduce the emissions right now, while we work on a way together to decommission refineries and get them out of our lives. The flip side of it is that we also know that big oil has been a corrupter of both politics here in California, in the Bay Area, in Richmond, in Benicia, in Contra Costa County, and internationally. And the violence perpetrated by not only government against people who are standing up for their rights, but also we've seen the desecration of natural environments globally, the Amazon, Africa, Nigeria, Indonesia, and we've seen it here in Richmond. And that is the kind of plan that this report lays out, that says we need to work on this and talk about this very explicitly sooner rather than later. And if there's going to be justice for the workers as well as justice for the people who live in the communities, who must be able to retain their residences in these communities as we clean them up, so that they who have paid the heaviest price for the polluters' impacts on our communities will get to reap the rewards of cleaning up their act and continuing to live in these communities, but now with a healthier environment. So I want to thank Greg Karras for putting this report together to initiate this conversation. This is going to take state, local, and county action, as well as a national plan. So thank you, Greg. Eduardo, back to you.
Yes, thank you, Andres. Next, we're going to have Maureen Brennan from the Rodeo community, and she's been doing fantastic work trying to make sure that Phillips 66 remains a good neighbor to the community of Rodeo and Crockett and all the other places around there. Thank you. Maureen?
Let's see if I can get my screen up here. Can you see my pictures?
Looking good.
Yes.
Oh, good. My name is Maureen Brennan, and my job here today is to give you a little flavor of what it's like to live next door to a refinery. My town of Rodeo was originally named Rodeo Vista. Then Unocal built a refinery in 1896, and it grew and it grew, and then there was no more Vista. They dropped the name, and now we're just Rodeo. I wanted to show you a few pictures of my Vista where I live. This is to the northwest, lovely San Pablo Bay. This is to the due west is Novato through the trees. There's lovely sunsets in Rodeo. And then this is the Vista to the north of Rodeo. This is the structure of Phillips 66 refinery. It's ever looming and ever polluting. And the refinery infrastructure is always in our face. This is where I walk in the morning. This is my evening walk. This is where I walk along the waterfront. This is when I go out in my kayak. This is what I see. This is what I see driving home on the freeway. This is what I see. This is the vista in the city of Martinez. Those folks have similar problems to us in the form of the Shell PBF refinery there. This is the vista driving home on Highway 4. This is the Phillips 66 carbon plant. And please take note of this particular picture. These kilns are the highest SO2 emitters in the entire Northern California area. And also notice the open piles of pet coke sitting right there. Yuck. So Phillips 66 is licensed to pollute. All the refineries along the Carquinez corridor have a Title V designation through the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. As a Title V major facility, it is allowed to emit up to 100 tons per year of the criteria air pollutants. There's a whole list of them. Also, as a Title V major facility, by definition, it emits more than 100,000 tons per year of greenhouse gases. So there's permission to pollute here. And I'll add, that is times 5 refineries that are in this area. Also of concern is that Contra Costa County policy neither regulates nor monitors stationary sites in this region. But 93% of the gross air polluters are stationary sites. And we have the health numbers to look at too, and they're bad. We have asthma rates in the 98th percentile. We have rashes, we have skin disorders, we have autoimmune diseases here. I guess these things won't kill you, but the cancer will. So the year 2030 is creeping up on us, and I sure wish we had a Green New Deal, but we don't. And the year 2045 is creeping up on us when California's target for carbon neutrality. It's no longer an option to hide our heads in the sand. We don't want to be like Star Trek. That's why Greg's paper on decommissioning is so important. The key is to have a plan, not just a Band-Aid. We must finally address the stationary sources of air pollution. They've been overlooked for decades, and Greg's plan, I believe, is a step in the right direction. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Maureen. The next speaker is Steve Garey, who has worked with the industry, and he is going to give us a viewpoint that we all need to know because we need to work together in solving this problem. Steve?
Thank you, Eduardo. My name's Steve Garey. I am a retired refinery worker here in Western Washington. I spent 25 years working for Shell and then Tesoro. North of Seattle, 4 of Washington State's 5 refineries are in 2 rural counties north of Seattle, between Seattle and the Canadian border. At the time I retired, I was past president of the United Steelworkers Local 591. I represented refinery workers and others for some years. And in retirement now, I work with the Blue-Green Alliance in Washington State. That's an organization that seeks to facilitate a dialogue between organized labor and environmental organizations looking for common cause and ultimately collaboration whenever possible. It's important to know that I do not speak for the United Steelworkers today, nor do I speak for Blue-Green Alliance. I speak for myself, but I do have some experience with these issues, and I'm glad to be here today. I want to thank the rest of you on the webinar for joining in. I particularly want to thank the authors of this report. I think it's timely, I think it's important, and that is particularly true in a refining community there in the Bay Area, and of course in Southern California we have more, that shares many similarities to the refining communities that I live in here in Washington State. I want to talk about a little bit different aspect of this. Many people come at this issue from a purely environmental perspective, which is certainly proper, I think, or a political perspective, as a number of voters increasingly want to do something effective about climate. I'm going to talk about a different kind of reality. I'm going to talk about economic reality. We live in a market-based economy, and that's an economy where price is the key thing. The reality here is that renewable energy is cheaper than fossil fuel energy in almost all markets now, and it's getting cheaper all the time. That is driving the movement away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy, a movement that I think is only going to accelerate because of this price reality. And this is, I think, important to understand. This is going to occur no matter what you think of environmental reality or political reality. And as the demands for refined fuels go down, the feed rates in these refineries will also go down to the extent they need to produce for a domestic market. And of course, as demand in international markets are reduced, they'll go down overall. What we don't know is how long the refineries can hold out. I don't see refining industry simply disappearing. I think we'll have to refine something. We certainly ought to be refining carbon neutral jet fuel. We may be able to refine products that are not meant for internal combustion, but the question then becomes, what happens to people in these communities that are so dependent economically on the refining industry for so long, for generations? What happens in those communities if people lose their work? These are the best jobs these people have ever had. And we talk about justice for these people and for these communities. I don't know if I know that justice is going to look completely different depending on your perspective. If you're a worker, justice, if it's possible, is going to look quite different than if you're a member of a frontline community that has largely missed out on the economic benefits for far too long. And it certainly will look different for those who are concerned about local governments, their budgets, their ability to provide public services, how to replace the tax base, and all of that. So justice is in the eye of the beholder. But for workers, at the very least, we should, if it's going to be anywhere near like justice, we have to consider how to support their income and their benefit plan. For as long as reasonable, as long as to make it manageable. I choose that word manageable carefully because I don't know if there's anything manageable about losing the best job you've ever had. But it's important to realize economically that each refinery worker, economists apply what's called economic multiplier. These are very high paying jobs, and each one is able to support, I know it's thought in my community, up to 7 to 10 other people who may not realize their own employment is so directly tied to the viability of the refining industry, people who may not be able to work if those jobs are gone. And so we're not talking about just a couple thousand refinery workers, we're talking about 7 to 10 times that in a community and the tax base that goes along with it. Obviously, everybody should be concerned about how these potential problems can be addressed, particularly in refining communities, everybody from workers to others in the community. And how we deal with these issues largely will determine, at least in refining communities, how much of the benefit of a renewable energy economy we're able to achieve. I think the key for workers here, as well as others, is to find alliances within the community, to find friends in the community. I don't think anybody can do that. They can't find those alliances if they're seen to be part of the problem. I think workers have to be seen as part of the solution to these issues if they're to have friends when they need them. It's that identity as part of the solution that leads to collaboration. Ultimately, what we need to do for communities is build the biggest we possibly can. We have to get past me before we can get to we. I would note that the industry, when it comes to push to shove, the industry is going to fall back on their goal of maximized profits. In my view, they're going to look to senior executives and other large shareholders' interests first. That will not include generally community interests or workers' interests. And so it's crucial that community advocates, organizations, workers, and others find a way to identify common cause, be part of the solution, and work together. I think only in that way can communities maximize the potential benefits of this movement away from fossil fuels by minimizing the short-term harm. I'm done, Eduardo, for now.
All right, thank you. I would like to have all the panelists come back on so that we can answer the questions that have been provided. One question which continually shows up is how will the decommissioning take place? Who will regulate it? Who will coordinate it? So, Greg, could you begin?
Yeah, apologies, I'm having some trouble restarting my video. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
All right, maybe just restate the question.
All right. A lot of people have been asking about the process of decommissioning. Who would be in charge, and how would the refineries decide who would start and at what level they would begin?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, no one should pretend this is going to be easy. Probably the way to think about it is in 3 steps. First, think about nuclear power plants in California. California had many of them. California is now in the process of decommissioning the last of those. The others have been decommissioned. So that's the first part, and I can come back to that. Second part, think about how refineries are different. Steve Garey just did a really great job of talking about this in a way that I think people who really know it can, so everybody can understand it. I tried to. The bottom line is that we are in this toxic relationship with oil, economically, socially, even to some extent, some of our values. And so this is personal. At the same time, it's got to be a collective action. It's economic, takes policy. So go back to how they did it with nuclear plants. California Public Utilities Commission in California was largely part of this. And they made sure that there was a plan and it was implemented to build up and replace the energy supply. That was done largely through efficiency, also for this and other reasons, with huge growth in solar, wind, renewable energy. And the bottom line is that the lights are still on. Our power prices are higher than the country on average, but we use so much less electricity because of that efficiency that they're about the same in terms of actual costs. It can be done. Andres mentioned who pays and how to make sure that we're not abandoned by the companies when they decide to leave. There are other examples, but the Nuclear Regulatory Commission actually requires nuclear plant owners to pay upfront into a trust fund for cleaning up the radioactivity. We need a trust fund that cleans up the whole mess, the toxicity that's left in the soil and in the economies of our communities. Just transition bonds. That's one of the report's recommendations. And then, so the third thing is that this has to be done largely locally with federal support, or at least state support. And the state can do this if the federal government continues to be AWOL. We need a social safety net because the jobs, there's plenty of jobs, but they won't necessarily be in the same places and they will change. And everybody knows, I think, that the average gig worker job now doesn't pay the rent and the mortgage and the food and the college tuition, the healthcare for the family. So we're going to need that social safety net that we need for other reasons as well. These issues are inextricably connected. And so finally, I would say that on the local side of it, I've seen this happen with the power plants that are no longer there in San Francisco because they were decommissioned. These were gas-fired plants that were replaced by renewable energy and efficiency. And I was part of that. When you do it locally, you need to be figuring out what goes in everybody's front yard and backyard, and that can really only be done collectively in the intimate local setting. Eduardo, I know you know this as a former planning commissioner and as a city council member in Richmond, that, you know, the reason why the powerful federal or state government in Sacramento hasn't taken away your land use authority is they can't do it. It has to be done locally. And that's, you know, so I would just add that to what Steve Garey said, is that we not only in our communities face the brunt of this pollution and this economic blight and this huge risk of going off this cliff where we get more of both if we don't act now, and that's irreversible. We not only face that, but we have the power. We have a type of power in our communities to build from the grassroots up locally what Washington and Sacramento can't build without us. That's why they should be supporting us. Does that help?
You're on mute, Eduardo.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I was asking if any other panelists had something they wanted to add. If not, then I'd like to get to the next question, which is a very interesting question. We have a lot of petroleum products which are integrated into our economy. For instance, jet fuel. I noticed that jet fuel was one of the things that that is very important to our way of life. How can jet fuel be carbon neutral? And how do we continue producing lubricants and other items that is necessary, and plastics? You know, plastics are petroleum based.
So I'll take a shot at starting this. Hopefully others will join in. In California, we're a fuels refining state. It's not quite the same as say in parts of the Gulf Coast of the US, where there's a lot of petrochemical plastics industry. So it's, there's byproducts and there's some lubricants, like, you know, motor oil, but it's like mostly gasoline, distillate diesel, jet fuel. The gasoline and the diesel, I think the person who's asking this question, or the people asking this question, are probably know this, but just to be clear, we have electric cars that go 3 times as far per unit energy, and their batteries are getting better. We have biofuels. We have lots of alternatives to gasoline and diesel. Those are proven in practice. But jet fuel, we can blend biofuels into it. There is, in my opinion, and the report says this, the jury is still out on whether petroleum-free jet fuel will be proven in practice and when. So what the report does is it takes that uncertainty into account, and the trajectories that I showed you and the ones in the report's analysis are based on holding 10 to 20%. And it actually recommends holding 20% of refinery capacity in reserve. This is consistent with California's climate targets that end up with an 80% cut. It's one of the reasons why we have to start now. We can buy ourselves a year or two before we go over that cliff of infeasibility or severe transition impacts. If we assume that we're going to curtail jet travel, in case it doesn't work out that we can get petroleum-free jet fuel. But the report doesn't recommend that. The report is based on what is technically feasible and proven in practice today.
So I'd like to jump in real quick that particularly when we look at the world of plastics, is that was a market created as a way to use product that was now becoming accessible. And it's been a disaster for the environment. Look at the garbage patch out in the Pacific. So I think one of the things that we have to do collectively is to realize that we have to quit subsidizing big oil and natural gas. We need to change the tax codes that give advantages to these industries. We need to shift all of those advantages to renewable energy sector. And, you know, one of the things is that's a key difference between the United States and, say, Europe, is that they heavily tax their transportation fuels in order to subsidize public transportation, and that they have a highly developed integrated public transportation system as a result of that. So the United States, we need to re-examine our values. We're in this period of time now where we're doing that. And it's not just a matter of convenience. This is a matter of planetary survival. We have to keep that in mind. We have to keep the legacy of our children, our grandchildren, great-grandchildren in mind. That has to be our priorities, not next quarter's dividend distribution.
I'll add just a little bit to that. Certainly no expert here, no engineer, no economist, but there almost certainly are renewable or at least carbon neutral alternatives to petroleum based upon, or rather plastics based upon petroleum. I know that's true for jet fuel. When I was a Tesoro employee, that corporation took a very, very close look at a significant investment in both the infrastructure and the raw material to produce carbon neutral jet fuel from a plant-based oil. This was communicated to us as a proven technology and something that could largely replace petroleum jet fuel. So I believe those technologies and those alternatives are going to be available to us, and they're particularly important, of course, from plant-based oils if we can do it without interfering or somehow compromising our food sources, which was the case here with this camelina oil, the relative of canola, I believe. Number of other benefits to that. But anyway, I believe those technologies exist. It's just a matter of the political will, I think, and the capital to deploy them on a more of an industrial scale. So I think those are all hopeful signs for the refining industry in a future that has to be cleaner and safer than it has been now.
Thank you. I'd like to invite all the panelists to pipe in if they have anything that they want to add. I'd like to direct this at Steve Garey. Someone asked about the point that you brought, that it has to be a we, us, approaching this. And how do we get the unions on board with this plan?
Well, I think the most important thing to get union folks on board is to help rank and file union members understand where their interests are. Union leaders who have to be re-elected if they want to maintain their positions from time to time have a difficult time doing this on their own. And the reason is because whether we like it or not, I certainly don't, but whether we like it or not, a lot of our members are our members because they were employed by the refining industry. In this case, the union didn't pick them. They became our members because they became employees, and they don't always come to meetings. And if they're not active in the union, then they kind of miss out on a lot of the conferences and the conventions and the trainings and the other kind of things that can raise their awareness level. And so the key to, I think, bringing organized labor along is to help union leaders educate their members and help members understand that, again, particularly in the refining industry, no matter what they may think of environmental reality or political reality, the economic reality, hopefully, for those most pragmatic about it, will hopefully create the incentive to get on board, to educate themselves, and to become part of the solution. But however it happens, that education job has to occur. It's not easy to do, but it has to occur.
Thank
If
you.
I might just add to that, my boyfriend's nephew works for Tesoro, actually it's Marathon, formerly Tesoro, and he manages about 20 guys. And I asked him, about this, about how do his workers feel. And he said half of them are already retraining. They see the writing on the wall. Electric vehicles are taking over, and they're already moving on. And it's just a small segment, but I believe that the workers see the writing on the wall.
Yeah, I think that's true. That's probably accurate. I can tell you too, back to the Tesoro story where they nearly invested in this biojet plant. That got everybody within Tesoro really, really worked up, very positive, very excited. They want to be part of the solution. They're just looking for education and the reason to feel good about themselves in a future that's really quite uncertain for them.
And let's not forget that not all refinery workers are unionized. I know here in the Bay Area, Valero is non-union, and even Chevron has opened shop and has been losing union participation.
Yeah, that is also accurate. And of course, if you go back this economic multiplier, all those other thousands of jobs in the community that, you know, with workers that may not even realize how closely connected they are, many of them are non-union, unorganized as well. When I say workers, I mean all the workers.
Yeah, Steve, this is Greg, and I hope this is okay, but I want people to know that, you know, you and I have met fairly recently, although it feels like we're brothers when we talk about our experience. And so Steve Garey and I were talking about the report and how to communicate about the exports issue, and he raised a point that is really important, and I talked a little bit about in my opening statement, that look, on the one hand, it is just pure injustice for Black and brown people on the fence line of these refineries to face so much more of this toxicity so that refineries can make so much more fuel to export it, fuel that Californians don't need or use. And since they're high carbon refineries, that's actually increasing the global carbon intensity of oil. It's the opposite of what the industry says when they try to tell you that they're the cleanest in the world. I think they probably try to say that in every community. Steve brought up, and I want to ask you about this. You brought up the point that, well, but hey, Greg, you're also saying, and this is true, that this cliff we're heading for is in large part an economic crisis in the communities and in the workforce. And look, you know, our economy, whether we have a paycheck, whether we have the stress of poverty, that's part of our health too. So it's our livelihoods and our lives. And there are situations where, and this is true in the industry, where it's smoother to be able to export in balance to a limited extent. So should we, could you talk more about how that works and why communities should know that it might be it would be in workers' interest and might be in the community's interest in some cases to hold a little bit of that export capacity in reserve as well?
I think, Greg, you and I began talking about this from what I understood to be the United Steelworkers kind of historic view on manufacturing and the role of exporting. United Steelworkers have under contract hundreds of thousands of manufacturing workers. They have historically opposed the export of raw materials, which includes crude oil, but supported the export of finished products because they recognize that manufacturing in general is a value-added economic activity that's important if we are to maintain, what most Americans would perceive as an adequate standard of living. While we feel that the markets for refined petroleum products will have been reduced and will continue to be reduced over time, we think that as long as there's a market for those products somewhere, that American manufacturers and American workers ought to produce for that market, again, as long as it's as absolutely as safe and clean as possible, in order to make this movement away as manageable as possible. And again, I use the term manageable carefully. And so that's the steelworkers position. It's largely a union organized labor position. Exports are important to dampen or to extend the economic harm that might be realized if we simply stop doing that sort of thing. We need American workers to produce products in a market that we know is a world market, and to simply stop doing that is likely to result in much more severe consequences economically than we have to experience. But the key, obviously, particularly for frontline workers and others, or frontline communities rather and others, is to do this with a much higher degree of safety and environmental protection than has been done up to this time. We have in place now in California a much better, I believe, what we call a process safety management regulation. We hope that's going to help us. Certainly more of that is going to be required to do some level of justice as we wind this dependence on fossil fuel down in frontline communities.
Yeah. So, yeah, and my response to that would be that, exporting drugs, guns, oil, steel, and grain are all very different situations. And I think that where oil exports were probably rightly seen at one time, maybe long ago, but at one time, as being very beneficial to the energy economies and standards of living to people everywhere. I think that now we need to start thinking about exports as exporting economic dependency on developing that should be leapfrogging us and not rebuilding the oil industry somewhere else. And
yeah, and we'll have to have a discussion too about how we define exports. Generally, when I say the word export, I mean transport to a foreign country, as opposed to movement of products and intermediate products from one domestic facility to another. We don't consider that export when it moves from one U.S. facility to another.
Right.
But,
so some of this is that, and just for everybody else, in the policy debate, keep in mind that these questions are very closely tied to assumptions about how much we can get from biofuels, and literally this idea of harnessing Mother Nature to sequester the carbon in plants and then burn it and create that sort of a cycle. My good friend Gary Hughes with Biofuel Watch is reminding us all that there are very, very serious limitations on that. Remember what people call the insect apocalypse? This is now global scientific consensus that human changes to land use and other environmental factors that have something to do with climate change and oil fertilizers, as well as other factors, that those changes to land use have gotten to the point where there is a hard limit on how much carbon we can sequester with biofuels. This is actually potentially a problem. It may be technically feasible, but not environmentally or geophysically feasible to use all the biofuel and jet fuel and everything else that people pretend that we can use it for without literally facing mass famine. That's actually the consensus of the IPCC, the UN Climate Agency, and the International Body on Biodiversity. It doesn't get talked about enough here, but there's a real limit on how much we can pretend that we're going to find some silver bullet in the future. That's one of the reasons why, although it's kind of obvious that we can probably find some way to run jets without petroleum in the future, it's not proven technology from the report's perspective. Just to be clear.
This is John White. I've been invited to answer questions, and since I didn't get any, I thought I'd introduce myself and make a couple points. Greg Karras asked me to join because of my background in air quality, toxics, and energy regulation. And in the course of my career, I've seen a few transitions of the kind that we're talking about, maybe none this big, but just a couple of thoughts. First of all, we haven't talked much about e-jet fuel made from electricity, which can be created from renewable wind and solar and convert it into hydrogen. And there's a big plant being built in Europe that would use offshore wind to create e-jet fuel. So it's not just biofuels, and I agree that that's a legitimate and important debate to have. I also think that the accelerated penetration of electric vehicles worldwide is likely to affect demand for the products that we export. And I think what's most important about the report is its holistic grasp of the whole process of the refining industry. We've regulated pieces of it, but we've never really looked at the overall supply demand, what the fuel feedstocks emissions are. We don't regulate that in California. We also, I think, need to think about an orderly transition that will allow the refineries to be cleaned up incrementally where we can. There's a number of technologies that can reduce emissions and reduce toxic risk, but at the same time, recognizing that greening the refineries isn't enough, that we need to really transition them and recognize, as I think the report does in terrific fashion, the importance of focusing on the communities and the workers as much as anything else when we start thinking about decommissioning and transition. So with those two comments, I just wanted to congratulate Greg and the team for putting this together. It's a really good piece of work. It's unlike anything I've ever seen, and I'm glad to be here.
Thank you, John. And for people who don't know, V. John White has it going on. He's been doing this a long time. I'm honored that he's joined us.
I would like to thank all of the panelists for being part of this. There's a lot of questions that are yet to be answered. For instance, the oil industry has ingratiated themselves into many avenues of our economy. For instance, our ag business is heavily tied into it with their pesticides and their fertilizers. And as I said before, the plastics, but I heard comment that petroleum isn't necessary for plastics, that there's other ways to do that. And there's other ways to do ag, but it's going to take a managed approach in order to make this transition away from petroleum. And we're near the end, so if the panelists would like closing statements, Greg, would you like to start?
Well, I just appreciate you all, and I kind of gave my closing statement. I think the big truth of this report, what it's about, is that we need to talk about how we're going to break free from our toxic relationship with oil before it takes us over a cliff. And it was and is my greatest hope that people will read this report, will get it, will talk to each other about it, and will take the kind of discussion that I'm so honored to be in with you all here and grow it exponentially. I think that's the step. We need the courage to talk about this stuff and talk about it with everyone and demand that conversation. We're gonna have to solve this together.
Thank you. Maureen?
Yeah, thank you for this discussion today. It's really interesting to hear all of this. But most importantly, I think we have to stop thinking oil's going to go away. It's not. It's going to be phased out, and that's the whole deal with this report. It's talking 5% a year to do it gradually, and so we don't have to fall off the cliff. So we're prepared for this transition. So we'll see where it goes. Thank you.
And John, if you'd like to join us again, my apologies for not introducing you when you jumped in with us. Well, while we wait for John to return, Steve Garey.
I'll reiterate my thanks for everyone who's participating. Again, for those who prepared the report. Again, I think we're talking about the right thing at the right time, at the right place. If anything, we should have been talking about it 10 years ago, I guess. Maybe the timing is not perfect, but certainly sooner rather than later. The more we begin to get our heads around what we have to do together in order to minimize harm and maximize the benefits in the future, the better. It is one of those kind of complex pay me now or pay me later kind of things. We don't want to pay the price later. We want to pay a smaller price now. So thank you all.
Thank you. Andres.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Eduardo. I think what this report represents to me is a starting point for us to begin to map out the different pathways in our respective communities about how we are going to elevate this decommissioning process. I think it's incumbent upon communities like here in the Bay Area, the city of Richmond, the city of Benicia, Contra Costa County, to start having study sessions and community forums, not only to initiate the idea, but to start to lay out the pathways for a plan that will make this transition that we must go through to save the planet an orderly one, one that builds consensus. We know the industry will use all its tools to try to deviate from this process. But if we are united together, we can make this happen. So thank you, everybody.
I'd like to once again thank everyone. Greg, thank you so much for this report. I've tried to initiate conversations with Chevron's community outreach person around decommissioning the Chevron plant. And now I have an instrument, a document to have that conversation with.
Eduardo, that's awesome. It was going to be my ask after we got off this call, so thank you for being smarter than me. And I wanted to say to everybody, if you want a copy of the report, you can get it from my website, www.energy-re-source.com. That's energy-re-source.com. There's other materials there. I'd like to ask if our electronic moderator from Stand Earth might want to speak. Stand also has a site that includes a letter signed by more than 40 groups that will be sent to Governor Newsom today regarding immediate action on some of the findings of the report. And so Stan, would you like to let people know where they can find that folder?
Matt, did you want to jump back in, or I'll post it again in the chat?
Sure. Hey, folks. Matt Krogh from Stand.Earth. If you take a look at the chat window there, I just reposted the Google Drive that also has the link to Greg's fantastic report. Thank you for the report. A source materials, background for that, a press release for today, as well as the letter that will be sent to Governor Newsom at close of business today that is somewhere near 50 now groups that are endorsing the principles and the summary of that report. So thank you all so much for this great panel. Thanks.
Thank you. And with that, goodbye.